I'm going to do a bit of a multitasking thing. I'm going to be giving the first talk, and I'm also chairing the first session. Now, it's obviously I need to introduce myself. So I'm Andrea Hammel. I'm reader in German at Aberystwyth University, and I'm a committee member of the Research Center for German and Austrian Exile Studies. So I would like to welcome you here to London, but of course I'm not in London at all. I'm actually in Wales, and I've actually just taught an undergraduate seminar on the experiences of German-speaking refugees in the UK, and now I'm here. So this would never have been possible in real life. So I'm very pleased that in some ways we can do it like that. I will do the first sort of bit of magic. I'm actually going to try and share my screen, and we hope that will work. I'm going to share my PowerPoint, hopefully. And then I will start my proper talk. Can someone tell me that they can see the first slide of my PowerPoint? I'm assuming this is the case.
Andrea, yes, we can.
Okay.
Thank you.
Excellent. Today I will explore the memory of the second generation through texts written by the UK children and grandchildren of former refugees. I have no family connection to the subject. I have come to this via an academic route. I have now many friends who are first generation refugees and many more who are second or third generation. Despite not having a family connection to the subject, I am keen to let people speak who have first-hand experience of the subject, and therefore I'm today going to investigate texts from the publication Second Generation Voices, the newsletter of the Second Generation Network. I'm going to investigate them as cultural narratives, reimagining Holocaust and dislocation trauma. I will look at them as examples of post-memory, a term coined by the American scholar Marianne Hirsch. I will investigate whether these trauma narratives can add to our understanding of fleeing and resettling. US scholarship began to examine the phenomenon of the second generation earlier than the UK. In the introduction of the generation of post-memory, Hirsch outlines her own intellectual development, which ultimately led to her developing her influential theory of post-memory. Originating from the liberation movements of the 1960s and 1970s, Hirsch argues that the memory started serving as a form of counter-history, exposing power structures and exploring the forgetting and erasure of certain events and developments, rather than offering these grand, fixed narratives. Hirsch also describes how a relative of hers and her friend, all Holocaust survivors, started talking about their past, which they had not done before, after watching the US television series Shoah in 1987. In Britain, Anne Karpf, in her book The War After, identified the year 1996 as the point when the attention of the British public shifted from exclusively focusing on the British war victory to looking at the causes and consequences of the Holocaust as well. As Second Generation Voices was first published in 1996, it can be argued that the same events furthered their narratives of witnessing the second generation experience. Hirsch's concept of post-memory was also developed at this time. In the 1990s, Hirsch started to use the term to describe the relationship that the second generation developed to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of the first generation. According to Hirsch's theory, the second generation remembers Holocaust trauma by means of the stories, images, and behaviors among which they grew up. Hirsch argues that these experiences were transmitted to them so deeply and affectively as to seem to constitute memories in their own right, rather than narratives told to them. Post-memory's connection to the past is thus mediated not only by recall, but also by imaginative investment and creation. This can be seen in many of the texts in second-generation voices. The UK descendants of Holocaust survivors and refugees grew up with overwhelming inherited memories. Their post-memory is shaped by traumatic fragments of events that are difficult to comprehend, while their effects continue into the present. Additionally, some members of the second generation report that their parents were unable or did not wish to speak about their experience to their children. For this generation, the Holocaust means the eternal presence of an absence. That is, those who were murdered in the Shoah. The legacy of the Holocaust is present in a variety of ways for the second generation. Issues of intergenerational communication, parental enmeshment, and separation concerns. While many members of the second generation were glad to be accepted as such and were happy to be able to develop spaces where they could express themselves, others felt conflicted about joining such groups. Menachem Rosensaft describes that he was initially not sure whether he wanted to join any second generation group, but when he heard how others defined their experience, he decided that the second generation needed to organize and present and represent themselves. I changed my mind in the fall of 1979 at the New York Conference on Children of Holocaust Survivors. Organized by a well-meaning Jewish organization, this conference featured psychologist after psychologist. In turn, each of them publicly dissected our supposed pathology, trauma, guilt complex. I was appalled. I did not recognize myself or any of my friends in the collective psychobabble to which we were subjected. It soon became apparent that the children of Holocaust survivors and the children of refugees are not a very heterogeneous group, and that it was problematic to deduce general trends of mental well-being from those members of the second generation, be it survivors, be it refugees, who had entered treatment for mental health conditions, and used these cases to generalize. The transgenerational transmission of trauma became an established concept in the 1990s, but the focus switched towards how families worked. Families provide the socialization of children. Children learn values, beliefs, and attitudes through direct teaching or indirect observation. The results of the present-day study strongly support the transgenerational submission of depression, guilt, and shame from Holocaust survivors to second generation and their children. However, most recently, a number of studies have been published arguing that there's no increased occurrence of depression and other associated problems among the children of refugees or survivors. The first issue of second generation Voice, as it was then, and Voices as it became later, contains statements by children of survivors and refugees in which they outline how and why they have been affected by their parents' experiences. One early contribution by Susan Butnick, entitled "The Experience That Began in the Womb," is remarkable. I believe that my experience began in the womb and was later absorbed through my mother's milk. The Holocaust experience passed down in diluted form to my innocent lips and through me to my children. If I still feel that everything can be taken away from me at any time, isn't it likely that my children feel the same? Feel it too, actually, sorry. Butnick's narrative describes an embodiment of Holocaust experience rather than a mere recalling of what her parents had told her about their experience. It is interesting that Hirsch argues that the emergence of memory as counter-history originated from the liberation movements such as the second wave feminism in the 1960s and 70s. Budnik's post-memory narrative is reminiscent of aspects of women's writing that came to prominence among French feminist thinkers in the 1970s. Budnik feels that the Holocaust experience was similarly remembered through bodily transmission rather than through intellectual remembering. Whether we agree with or are critical of this essentialist aspect of this definition, it is clear that Budnik was influenced by similar ideas as Hirsch. Creating a post-memory narrative, Budnik shows that she does not only remember what she has been told about the experience of her parents, but that she explores events before her birth and before her conscious remembering. Budnik creates a counter-history exposing the problematic power of authenticity. The first generation experience is more authentic and explores the forgetting of her second generation experience. The actual article in the second generation voice is accompanied by two photographs. The photographs are very prominent but have no caption. One depicts three young children in summer clothes staring into the camera, and the other photograph depicts a man in the traditional attire of an Orthodox Jew holding a small blonde child. Until one is halfway through the article, it is unclear whether the children are in fact Budnik and her siblings and their father post-war, or her father with his murdered first family. In the article, Budnik explains that the photographs do, in fact, show her murdered siblings, and that her mother, also a Holocaust survivor, used them to explain her father's traumatic family history to Budnik and her siblings. This powerful ambiguity is an aspect of this post-memory trauma narrative. The reader has to go on a journey of discovery that is hard to put into words and difficult to take in, even to those personally not involved. Hirsch has written at length about photos of families and the deception and the power behind photographic representations in her earlier book, Family Frames. Using numerous examples, Hirsch shows how family photos are used to work through traumatic dislocation in a post-Holocaust world. In the case of Budnik's article, the two family photographs represent the disconnection as well as the connection between the memory of the living and the murdered relatives. By not adding captions, and thus not making it clear on first sight who the family members in the pictures are, Budnik powerfully conveys the ambiguity of dislocation. Surveying the texts published in second generation voices, it is clear that not all members and correspondents would formulate a similar narrative of embodiment of the Holocaust experience. Many narrate a journey of self-discovery that is often a description of an actual journey to places outside the UK. In the case of Marianne Arrhenius, the destination was a house in the northeast of Germany that used to belong to her family, the Weil family. Because her father has already passed, she's the one who gains possession of the house. And although she has never lived in the house, it seems full of memories for her. It is as if the time has stood still for 52 years, and my mind is back in 1941 when it all happened. What will my feelings be when I enter the house again? I must face the Holocaust and experiences that pain and anguish of my parents and my grandparents. Will the pain stop with me, or will it carry on to future generations? I do not want the suffering to continue, but I do want my grandparents to be remembered, along with the 6 million that perished with them? What can I do now to keep their names alive? This contribution exemplifies the tension between keeping memory alive and continuing suffering. The author writes, "My mind is back in 1941 when it all happened," representing an immediacy for the reader, although she herself was never present in 1941. She also wants her sons to visit, while making quite clear that the sons have taken different journeys in a literal and figurative sense. This contribution is accompanied by a photograph of the house. And again, it has no caption. Again, there's an ambiguity for the reader whether this depicts the house in the 1940s or the house in the 1990s. I'm concluding with a quote that is more critical of some of the experiences, memories, and post-memories I have outlined so far. A letter to the editor of Second Generation Voices reads, "There are other things I don't care for quite as much. First and foremost, there's an overall impression that the second generation contributors all seem to have taken the mantle of suffering from their first generation ancestors. There's a lot of looking backwards and grieving. I personally find this very difficult to deal with on several fronts. Yes, to shape what we are and what we will be, we have to understand where we come from. But the past is the foundation of the future. Where is the mention of the third generation? I think if the second generation invested more time into the third generation, instead of obeying about the first generation, their experience and how they affect us, it would be a positive and healthy approach. Let the hang-ups of the past rest. I believe you honor the dead by living positively." This is my last slide, and no doubt we will come back to some of the points I have made in my talk. And I very much also hope that the talks following on will take up some of my themes. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to a stimulating and challenging conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea and David. In 1998, a kinder transportee, also known as kind or plural kinder, remarked, quote, "I couldn't speak about my experiences, even with my kids." In 2021, a kind in the USA declared, quote, "At this time, we survivors need this organization," referring back to the old days. "We didn't know anyone else like us. It awakened so much in me. Now it's time for the second generation to take over." The second generation president responded, "Well, we need it now." These comments reflect an affirmation of handing the baton on with mutuality. My research, presently in an early stage, is ultimately looking at second generation of kinder transportees, I will call KT2s, organizing and participating in groups in the US and the UK. Part of this investigation is mapping of second generation groups and the engagement of KT2s. The drives and needs of second generation are palimpsest. My future research will be examining the multiple layers of group formation and KT2 drivers and kinder's responses to second generation involvement. For this presentation, I will provide a brief overview of the evolution of the two kinder transport organizations and the role of second generation in those groups, as well as a basic mapping of second generation groups in the UK and the US. I use a very broad definition of second generation as being children of individuals who were displaced, persecuted, and/or discriminated against by the racial, religious, ethnic, and political policies of the Nazis and their allies. Kinder are child Holocaust survivors, as are hidden children. Historians now consider the kinder transport as transnational, recognizing unaccompanied children who fled directly to countries other than Britain. For purposes of this talk, I am restricting my scope to kinder who came to Britain and either stayed or subsequently emigrated to the USA. To understand the differences between the USA and the UK, one must appreciate the experiences of the first generation. Kinder in the USA were involved in at least two uprootings. The ethos around foreigners, whether mythological or actual, of the UK and the USA differ. Theoretically, the USA is a nation of immigrants, and the UK had its historical heritage. Kinder in both nations, if possible, formed informal communities or links, even if geographically disparate, with other refugees, while others were isolated either by proximity or by social factors. Second generation were impacted by immersion in this dual, sometimes three or more cultures, influencing their identities and comprehension of their heritage and childhood experiences. Historically, kinder were told that they were, quote, just children and wouldn't remember their experiences, and that they were, quote, the lucky ones. Their experiences were not recognized as traumatic. As a result, kinder were not recognized as survivors. Many kinder absorbed this view and denied their own experiences as having been traumatic, thereby obfuscating their offspring's ability to identify as second generation. However, this did change, and slowly kinder were acknowledged to be survivors. And with this unveiling, KT2s could interrogate their own childhood experiences as possibly linked to the effects of the Holocaust on their parents. I mention this because some KT2s who attempted to engage with second generation groups did not feel a connection to the group, and in some cases were not welcomed. I will now look briefly at the two organizations that were exclusively formed for kinder transportees. Bertha Leviton, at age 75, suddenly had a, quote, urge and realization that nearly 50 years ago, children came to England and nobody had even mentioned it. I was thinking that it would be nice to meet a few people I had come over with and met at Dover Court Camp. And so began her journey towards organizing the first reunion of kinder transport, the 50th anniversary in June 1989. The event itself was attended mostly by kinder, some of their spouses and families. However, as one British KT2 recently remarked, I wasn't actually invited. It seemed it was more my dad's thing. My parents attended, but I did not learn of this until after the fact. The AJR became involved in the ROK, understanding that they would, quote, render assistance to those formerly transport kinder whom uprooting and orphaning left permanently affected and who have had no contact, previous contact with or knowledge of our organization. There was also a practical reason for the AJR recognizing kinder at that time. Quote, over the next few years, the AJR will have to focus more and more on kinder transport generation, the youngest within the entire refugee community, to keep up numbers. The ROK became a force for recognition of the kinder transport. In 1999, the 60th anniversary, ROK event included all generations. Gabby Glassman and Irene Bloomfield offered two fully packed multi-generation workshops. I, along with Melissa Hacker, organized an informal evening event for KT2s where well over 50 people packed into a room. The experience was one of a thirst to connect, to continue this journey. The ROK never created a formal organizational structure. 2Gs were not formally involved in this so-called organization, although they did assist and volunteer at the ROK events and reunions. Another survivor group, the Child Survivors Association of Great Britain, founded in 1995, which is mostly of hidden children, is also a special interest group of the AJR. They are also run by survivors, and the second generation are not involved. Members of this group have been clear, at least to me, that they are frustrated by the focus on second generation at Holocaust conferences. The Kinder Transport Association, known as KTA, is the only multinational kinder transport organization formed in the world and was the first registered charity based on the kinder transport. The KTA was started by a kind, Eddie Barrett, after he had attended the 1989 events. As he wrote, quote, "The first step for the KTA was an idea conceived in the belly of a plane on the way home from London. But he thought there had to be more than just hugs, kisses, talk, and memories. There should be more permanence, involving our families and our children. Also, perhaps we could aid needy children throughout the world as we had once been helped." Next, he created a board of directors, first selecting Kinder and then deciding he, quote, "wanted to include one or more of our children, the second generation." After meeting with me several times, after I had just moved to New York City, Eddie Barrett writes, quote, "I finally persuaded her to take an active part in the KTA. Shortly thereafter, the first KTA reunion was put together in October 1999. The last and 13th KTA reunion took place in 2015. It was the only KTA reunion as a result of the declining mobility of Kinder and limited human resources, much due to second KT2's life commitment. One must remember that the KTA is a totally voluntary organization. The KTA since has joined the World Federation of Jewish Child Survivors of the Holocaust for their conferences. As they were already active, the KTA was already active on the governing and executive boards of the federation. Second generation are now members of these boards. However, the experiences in this organization are a topic for another day. In October 1991, a second KTA reunion was organized in New York City. As I was now on the board and part of the organizing committee, it was essential to have a specific second generation workshop called Communication Between Generations, with myself and Kurt Fuchel on the panel. The room was overflowing. Multiple topics were raised, including discussions about whether Kinder were survivors, which was recognized by some, denied by some, and left others uncertain. KT2 started to speak up, stating that even though their parents had done the best to assimilate, they did feel different. And after the workshop ended, many of the KT2s clustered around and said they wanted to talk more about this. The outcome was the second generation group of the KTA, an informal part of the KTA, which was created by by Lisa Kolish and myself. Initially meeting on a bi-monthly basis at Lisa's apartment, crowding into her living room, the group eventually migrated to gathering at KTA reunions. All acknowledged the connection despite our varied upbringings and background, also finding that one's practicing religion was not important in this context. Melissa Hacker incorporated some of the group's conversations into her film, My Knees Were Jumping. All subsequent reunions and conferences continued to have workshops and speakers organized by and relevant to KT2s, with the 2015 conference organized solely by KT2s. Over the years, the multi-generation workshops for a while became only KT2 workshops, allowing exploration of their upbringing, identity, needs, and concerns. This created some tension with Kinder. Continuing to promote cross-generation communication, Melissa Hacker and I created the Oral History Project in 1993, training KT2s to be interviewers and interviewing Kinder at each conference as well as in their homes. This included interviewing individuals at ROK events as well. Some of these recordings are available at the Wiener Library as well as other archives around the world. The KTA Kinder Transport Memorial Quilt Project was launched and created by Kirsten Gross. All generations contributed. The 3.5 quilts are now on permanent display at the Michigan Holocaust Museum, along with a book with each image and the story written by the creator. At the exhibition, each story has been recited by actors and can be heard while looking at the quilts. I mention these projects as they were formed to engage KT2s and to enable passing of the stories which had so long been kept silent. The diagram here illustrates the chronological sequence of Kindertransport-related events. From the 1989 ROK conference, I did add to it the USA Epstein article because that had some impact on people, but also the gathering, the USA American gathering of survivors and descendants. But those were not necessarily involving Kinder. The events in red took place in the USA and the events in yellow took place in the UK. In the USA, there was a concentration of biannual conferences, providing opportunities for bonding of KT2s who had become aware of the KTA. You can see this. Despite all these activities, the Kindertransport is still not well known in the USA, although this is slowly changing through films by KT2s and the film about Nicholas Winton. And more importantly, that Kinder are now speakers sought for education and commemoration purposes. In the UK, the Kindertransport is now firmly rooted in Holocaust education supported by second generation. And I want to take a quick look at the formation of second generation groups, those which are exclusively run by 2Gs and those that are now multi-generational, and observe where second generation are participating. These charts are not definitive, but give a sense of the existing organizations. In the UK, there is now one multi-generational group, the AJR, with presently over 800 second generation members. The ROK originally was questionably a multi-generational group. While now part of the AJR, the Kindertransport Special Interest Section is run by Kinder while being supported by second generation. And the KTA and other 2Gs are now part of the organizational structure of the AJR as trustees. The 45A Society does not include KT2s. Looking at exclusively second generation groups, now some include third generation, KT2s are now part of these groups. This is not the case for the ACJR when it formed, nor its current organizing committee. KT2s are now elected members of the second generation network. Recently formed, Gathering the Voices and Generation to Generation, both were developed and run by KT2s as well as other 2Gs. Another important activity in the background from around 1989 was the offering and participation in cross-generation therapeutic workshops by Gabby Glassman and Irene Bloomfield. Ruth Barnett, as well as a few other psychotherapists, and the Raphael Center provided therapeutic support for second generation. As the USA is a large geographic area, there are several small second generation groups throughout. Some were formed in recent years, while others have disbanded. Of the main second generation only groups, none of them have KT2s as part of their organizing members. And there is no separate KT2 only formal group. However, when looking at multi-generational national organizations, the KT2s are active on the board level. Melissa Hacker became the first KT2 to run the KTA in November 2012. This was a big step in the transfer of power between the first and second generations. It required a lot of trust and forward thinking on the part of the kinder, and a courage on the part of the second generation. The World Federation is currently struggling with generational control and how to take the organization into the future, being guided by second generation. This is fully understandable, as many child survivors felt they had control over one thing, that was their story and their organization. At this point, I'm not willing or able to speculate or draw conclusions about the disparity of KT2s involved in the running of second generation and multi-generational organizations in the USA or the UK. Historian Rebecca Gopfert observed and wrote that there is a huge difference in self-identification of kindred transportees in the USA and the UK. My research will seek to learn whether this difference impacts self-identification of second generation and whether it translates into differences in their active participation in survivor and second generation organizations. Thus far, I have illustrated the distinct differences in the two primary kindred transport organizations and offered you a view of how kindred transport's participation in the USA and the UK differs. I'm interested to hear from anyone who can share these experiences, insights, or knowledge with me. Thank you for listening.
So what I'm going to talk about is, it's a rather clunky title. It's the long haul of displacement and refuge, because the notion of displacement and refuge does typically not end with one generation, because you have afterlives, not only psychologically, but as well legally. And I try to put those together. So what I'm trying to interweave is German legalese, which covers the categories German and access to German citizenship, which is actually a legal beast, to put it mildly, and the discontent amongst refugees from Germany and their descendants. If you do have any questions, feel free to email me, because I do actually do applied work with the High Commissioner, and I do work as well with you could say NGOs and interest groups in the area. So it's actually something which is a matter close to my heart, and I would say it comes first driving of justice, because unlike many of the descendants of Jews, I have been born with German citizenship, so my citizenship was never under threat. But I've seen quite a number of my very close family and as well friends struggle. And I've seen I've experienced since I was a child, the enormous discontent, not to say mayhem and upset, that dealings with German administration could cause. But I can give you the good news as well. We can see some kind of improvement, that actually German administrators start listening to anthropologists and historians, that we're actually trying to work together. However, that's a rather recent development. So to go back to the topics which I'm going to cover here, I've broken it down in 3 sections. So the first one is really only the legal basics, which govern the notion of citizenship. And then I'm going to talk what I call about the people, because anthropologists work with people, and it's in this case, my people were then pretty much my own Jews of German descent, or people who actually have, come from initially German Jewish families who fled Germany. And then I'm going to talk about changes and dynamics as well. And we can see those both in the legal arena, but we can see it as well within the group of those who might or who by now at times have access to citizenship. And I think that's a very strong intergenerational change, both on the German side, which are typically the administrators, but as well on the side of the applicants. Okay, so first section, the state and its administrators. The basic law in section 116 defines who is a German legally. Legally, a German is somebody who has a German parent. It does not say anywhere in this section of the basic law if it has to be the mother or the father. So if you have one German parent, legally speaking, from this overarching law, you're German. However, then citizenship law kicks in. And then you have various issues of zeitgeist, of you have political windows that open and close, and you do have as well legal whims. Because citizenship was until 1975 absolutely patrilineal. You actually needed a German granddad or German father to be a German citizen. And to make matters worse, if you actually had a German mom or a German grandmom, that lady by way of citizenship, by way of marriage to a non-German, which of course regularly occurred as German Jews fled to anywhere where they could. If she married a foreigner, she lost citizenship upon marriage. However, if she had lost her marriage, if she had already lost her citizenship by way of Nazi edicts, which kicked in 1941, she could reobtain it because that was then seen differently to marriage. At the same time, a German woman could only keep her citizenship from 1953 onwards if she married a foreigner, but the kids of this German woman would not be German citizens. Regardless if they were born abroad or in the country, they would inherit the citizenship of the father. Of course, there's a huge problem if that father didn't have any citizenship. So we do have a huge problem with a statelessness, which at times is still ongoing, but it has been at least somehow diminished because a law has been passed to limit statelessness. The only exemption to this very, you could say, staunch rules until 1975 were if the mother was not married to the father, then the child would actually be a German citizen by way of birth. And then until 1983 and 82, you do have as well the issue that if the father was a German and the mother was not, but these two were not married, the child would not be German either, because then the citizenship of the mother was relevant. So you see there's various catches, even though the basic law allegedly ensures that men and women are equal. That's a basic tenet of the law, which you see citizenship constantly infringes. At least from my perspective, it infringes. And then what we do have as well, we have the people who execute and that would be that's typically the Ministry of the Interior. Interestingly enough, it's not the Ministry of Justice. And the Ministry of the Interior does issue directives in order to fix the legal problems that occur between the basic law and the citizenship law. They've been doing that all along. And the last batch of changes was only passed in 2020. So you see, we're talking about very long periods of times. So since 2018, children of German mothers can finally can apply for German citizenship, and they will be naturalized if they were born before 1975. But this is based still on something of a discretion, but it will be passed in most cases. And since 2020, individuals who are Israelis and who cannot prove that they are Germans by descent can naturalize without losing their Israeli citizenship. Because before, the only ones who were allowed to keep their original citizenships were those who were naturalized under the basic law. So you see various catches to actually become legally German again. And I stumbled across this whole problem when I conducted ethnographic fieldwork for my PhD, which I conducted amongst Jews in Germany. I had actually set out to understand community building and transnationalism, because it's a highly transnational community. And then I learned about various discontents with restitution, with renaturalization. And so I became very curious. So one of the elements which I found very useful to look at was so-called biographical policy analysis. If you use that as a means, you look at the policy and you look at what does it do to people. Because typically the policy and the people seem to be somehow in different spheres. So that's what I started doing. And because it did not seem to interact particularly well, I approached the Federal Administrative Office. That is an administrative office which is adjacent to the Federal Ministry of the Interior. And they're the ones who are supposed to deal with all citizenship applications that come in from abroad. So I emailed them, and then an email ping pong started. Initially, they didn't know what to do with me, and they were very suspicious. And I got very official emails. And probably, as any of you knows, whoever tried to naturalize in Germany, those official emails are written in legal German. Legal German is a language that is very different from actual spoken language. And even though I grew up in Germany, and German is one of the languages I grew up with, so I do speak natively, I did not understand what they actually said. I had to learn a completely different language, and by that token, I had to learn a completely different conduct, because anthropologists and legal professionals act very differently. So this email ping pong went back and forth. At one point, one of the caseworkers got curious about what I was doing, and because I didn't give up, I kept on asking, and I told them, I can read the policies, I can read the law, but I do not understand how you evaluate those cases. And then one of the caseworkers got in touch with me, and he told me, it's like, if you like, we can meet outside for a coffee, not in the office, outside, because I'm trying to understand what you do. So I explained to him what I'm trying to understand, that I'm trying to understand the praxis of the German side, which I have to say to me was rather alien and alienating, in order to understand where things simply go wrong. And he listened to it, and he agreed to some parts, to other parts he didn't agree. But what he said is, you have to talk to the Federal Ministry of the Interior. That's the guys who take the decisions, and we just execute. Of course, you could say this were an exculpation mechanism. You shift it to a different level. So I did again the same. I emailed the Federal Ministry of the Interior, and again an email ping pong started. However, as a researcher, and I guess as well as a descendant, I was relentless. And at one point, again, they gave in, they caved in, and they decided to meet with me. And now it was the head of department for renaturalizations. The first meeting was tense. We were eyeing each other. I didn't quite understand how they were acting. They didn't understand how I was acting. But over the years, and we're now talking from where I'm speaking now, we're talking about 10 years. Over the 10 years, actually decent work relationship developed. And we started to exchange ideas and as well to work at stuff together in terms of how formalities are being done, how cases are being decided, because it was like then, interestingly, my input became interesting to them because they realized that simply avoids lawsuits and litigation. And this litigation in the area of citizenship, because then it falls into restitution and reparation from a German perspective, is always horribly embarrassing. So it was kind of, I was a useful tool, but at the same time, it did help a bunch of people as well. So I felt sort of okay about it. And then a completely different momentum started. In about 2018, the so-called exclusion group 116 gained a prominence. Most of those activists are actually British-based, and they started demanding access to citizenship, although they were children of German mothers and not of German fathers. And because it was mainly second and third generations who were active, and they were exactly the people that I'd always warned the Federal Ministry of the Interior about, because I told them at one point, people will litigate. The second, or at least the third generation, will not shut up, and they're not going to back down. So they always wondered, how I came across this and how, how I was so adamant that they would actually act. And then this group occurred, and they caused a massive stir. And what we could observe then is, and that's the changes and dynamics, that these two fractions were again talking very much past each other, and that the German side, that's the side of the administrators, felt that the activists were overstepping red lines, that they were actually trying to mess in German legal process. Of course they wanted to, because, you know, the activists, they wanted to reach an aim. So the communication attempts were very, very difficult, but what you could see was, well, issues of language, because most of those activists in the exclusion group did not speak German, or they didn't speak German natively. So they did say things which, if you speak English, they make perfect sense. But if you put them into German, they take a completely different dynamic. So you could see by way of the displacement, and that's a long-term effect of displacement. If you do not speak the language anymore, even though you might have a non-verbal set of communication skills, the communication falls apart. It was, in some ways, solutions were found, but it took another good 18 months to reach that level. And the whole thing actually ended up as well with the High Commissioner for Jewish Life and for Anti-Semitism. And it was discussed in various meetings, so that he actually stepped in and he tried to work reconciliatory. It did work, as I said, to an extent, because there's still quite some, you know, and from my perspective, understandable unhappiness out. And I'm not even going to pretend that that my side was in any ways unclear. So some legal and administrative solutions could be found, like this new directive that the children of mothers could naturalize and Israelis could naturalize without losing Israeli citizenship. At the same time, this ruling or this directive has not been extended to British citizens, because when the UK was part of the European Union, you could always take on German citizenship and keep your British citizenship. At the same time, now that the UK is not part of the EU anymore, that has changed, because it became a third country citizenship. So we'll see what's going to happen, because loads of those who apply are actually UK based. Now, the questions that I have been asking myself all along, and which I observed, and which I talked, which I tried to figure out, is: can citizenship function as a remedy? Because what I found in conversations with the activists was that, on the one hand, they wanted German citizenship because for them it was their right, because they came from German families who had been forcefully displaced. So it was about getting a right. And in some ways, it created a sense of justice, but as well of, I have overcome an obstacle and I get my rights back. But for some, I actually found the narrative that they felt that they got something back that was stripped from their grandparents. So they actually fulfilled an intergenerational mission. Interestingly, this kind of reasoning only came from the third, but not from the second generation. So there seems to be a generational difference, but I need to conduct more interviews to get to the bottom of it, if that is a general pattern or if these are odd ones out. And, you know, maybe some of the audience knows something about that. And then the big question is, when do these intergenerational changes kick in? Because I could actually observe them, but from what I have so far, it seems that that is very strongly bound to personalities. And personality is an issue that anthropologists are very wary of, because we tend to come from the perspective that, or we come from a social constructionist perspective, that, you know, fixed personalities are something which for us are very difficult to grapple with, that people are somehow fixed, and that expressions and performances tend to be based on wherever you are, and on the agency you can express in a given situation. So you could say what I've tried to give you was an overview over the work which I have been doing and which is obviously still ongoing. And these are the two questions, are the two final ones are actually the core questions. However, I can tell you as well way more about this work with German administration, and that at times it is very challenging, but at the same time, I have to admit that I could see changes in the policy is something that I guess in some ways reconciled me with the country where I was born and raised, and which I left after school, and I went to the UK, and I actually took on British citizenship as soon as they offered it to me. And at that point in time, obviously, I could still maintain German citizenship, but it's something which, so in some ways, this remedy of working in this area did have as well an impact on me. I thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me or to send me an email. And as I said, Austrian citizenship, that's more Gidon's thing than mine.